Hi everyone. Well, if you're watching this video, it means that you're almost to the finish line in our course on Judges. So thank you for sticking it out, for all of your hard work and effort and interaction during this summer as we contemplated the book of Judges. So just a few closing thoughts on the book that I have. Some of these are sort of the same every time I read Judges. Some of them are a little bit different. The biblical text is always a bit different because we are always a bit different when we encounter it. So some things seem the same and some things seem to have changed. But personally, when I read the book of Judges and I study it and I think about it, I think of it a lot still as kind of a book of case law. So, what do I mean by that? Well, I see them as a series of stories where we, the reader, are invited to ask the question, was justice really done here in this case? So, um, Ehud's assassination of the Moabite king. Was justice done there? Was that necessary? Was that something that we are supposed to praise? Is it something that we're supposed to be appalled by? Is it sort of a necessary evil? But it helps us think about just issues of justice and what justice even is. And then as we work through the book, the cases, to my mind at least, get harder and harder and harder. And so by the end, we have the Israelites sort of willy nilly implementing things like, oh, this is fair. Let's steal these women so that the Benjaminites can have wives. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a just outcome. So our sense of justice seems to be bumping up against what the Israelites as characters are thinking about their sense of justice. And sometimes, again, by these stories at the end, you just kind of throw up your hands and say, there is really no justice that can be done in this case. And if there is justice to be done, I'm not even exactly sure how to approach it. So for me, the book always raises these questions about justice. Also, I think for the Deuteronomist, once again, as we mentioned way back at the beginning of the course, um, that the Deuteronomist is very interested in the question of teaching and adjudicating the law and morality in a way that will endure beyond any one particular leader, any one particular judge, any one particular deliverer. So, and sort of how does that happen? And I think we see by the illustration of the Levites at the end of the story that just because you have an institution doesn't necessarily guarantee that things are going to go well and that they're going to pass on ideas that are necessarily good. So for the Deuteronomists, staying close to the law, staying kind of close to the word in essence. So remember, one of the rules and the laws of the king is that they have to read the law every day, and that they have to have a copy made for themselves. They have to read it every day and think about it. And so, two, I think for us, that word, the connection to the word, has to be an everyday thing. And if we don't have that, then it's too easy for whole institutions, for whole groups of people to just go off the deep end. So when I look at the people in the book of Judges, sometimes, and maybe this is just human nature, but I do see our own society and maybe our church institutions in somewhat of the same place as the Israelites were in Judges. So, we can point to people who were or are still good leaders from time to time. But so often it seems like we have as many bad ones as good ones. And sometimes it seems like we have more bad ones than good ones. And even though leaders do great things, they are also very flawed people. And so part of it is maybe just coming to an understanding that leaders are flawed people, something we don't have, it's easy to lose touch of. But also, That, though, on the other side, if the leadership is bad, things are probably not going to go well. So, what is it that can bring about better leadership for our churches, for our society, for um, just other types of institutions that we have? So there's something in this book about leadership, and it seems like right now, this is just my own personal perspective, but right now we're having somewhat of a crisis of leadership, and there's a lot of institutional skepticism out there, and probably this bad leadership has led to a lot of cynicism about religion in general, about Christianity in specifically, and about some modes of Christianity in specific. Um, and then in the middle of all of this, what sometimes seems like a very chaotic environment, how does the faith get passed on? And we know that if the faith doesn't get passed on, that ultimately there will be this forgetting that the Israelites experienced, and then things will not go well for us. So right now we see a lot of larger religious institutions, denominations, seminaries under a great deal of pressure, and we don't know whether in the long term those particular structures will continue, um, and if they don't, what is going to take its place? So the people in the book of Judges, I would say, operate in this similar in between space. They can see that things aren't quite working. Sometimes they work great, but by and large, there is sort of this downturn, deterioration of things. Now, maybe I'm just being very, very negative here. Maybe you have a much more positive outlook, but this is just the way I see things. So maybe just humor me. But I see us being at a very in between place, and I see the people of the Book of Judges also at a similar in between place. They don't sort of see what institutions are coming next. They know that what they have right now isn't really working, and even though sometimes it's great, it never seems to last. So what do they do? What do you do in the middle of all of this collapse and trauma and in betweenness? And how are you able to reflect back on what has happened? And ultimately, in the long picture, I guess the story for the Israelites doesn't really end very well. At the end of the book of Second Kings, they're all taken into exile, and the kingship comes to an end. So that brings us back to one of our very first original questions in the course: why in the world did the Israelites record their story in the first place? And that is something that still amazes me. So maybe part of the process of writing their story helped them reflect back, and I think it definitely did help them reflect back on what went wrong. So after the kingship is ended, after the temple is destroyed, and they take a look back at all of these old stories, I think they're able to see, at least to a certain extent, what went wrong. So again, this is one of the great, great, great oddities of the ancient world, that we have this huge body, relatively huge body, of self-reflective literature that was painstakingly preserved over millennia. And yes, sometimes it glories in its own victories, but often, 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 it is very self-critical and a story that ends in defeat. So why tell a story that ends in defeat? And maybe that's a bit of a mystery, but in some sense, the Israelites don't seem to care how bad their story makes them look. I think ultimately they wanted to tell their story. God wanted them to tell their story. And even God wanted you to hear their story. even if it's not a very pretty story. So I hope as you go from this course, I don't know, maybe you can think about stories that sometimes people ask you to hear that are not very pretty, but stories where people are trying to reflect on the trauma of life, what went wrong, and maybe trying to help people think about, yes, even though things may seem to be collapsing at a personal level, at a environmental level, at a governmental level, that something new will come along to take its place. Anyway, thank you very much for taking this course. I hope you found at least something in it that you found rewarding. Beyond the great stories that are in the book of Judges, I hope you at least got a smattering of what in the world is going on in the kind of weird academic world of biblical scholars, what biblical scholars look at, look for, what all kinds of questions they ask. And maybe some of these same questions are questions that you're asking as well. So, for the final Dale question, since this course is all about questions, what, if anything, did you find helpful from this course? So I know that there's a more formal evaluation process, and I would encourage you to do evaluations. But just for my own interest, tell me what you found helpful from this course. You can talk about what irritated you, or any other ideas, thoughts, reflections that you had about our experience together this summer. So thank you. I am always grateful for all of your hard work, for all of your input, all of your great ideas and thoughts. I learn each and every time I teach. I learn every time I even teach this particular course. So take care. God be with you, and go forward in peace. Bye-bye.